Picture this. You are standing in the great hall of a crumbling chateau, somewhere between the Pyrenees and the Atlantic, in the early years of the 14th century. The air is cold, carrying the damp scent of stone and wood smoke. Along the walls, faded tapestries depict the triumphs of knights who died before anyone in this room was born. The candles flicker, casting elongated shadows of nobles who know that tonight the entire kingdom might shift beneath their feet. Before we step deeper into this story of love, betrayal, and the consumption of a human heart, if you find these glimpses into the darker corners of our past compelling, consider sharing this with those who love forgotten histories. And please, let me know in the comments where you're reading from. It astonishes me that we can gather here across centuries and continents to unearth stories long buried by fear and silence. What you are about to hear is not merely another medieval tale of treachery. It is the story of how a woman, raised among vipers and kings, learned to wield her grief and fury as weapons sharper than any blade, reshaping the fate of a fractured realm through one irrevocable act. According to historians, the wedding feast that unfolded in the spring of the year 1319 would become legend, an event whispered about in abbeys and marketplaces, retold as both cautionary tale and testament to the consuming hunger for power. Marguerite of Valois was born the third daughter to a minor branch of the Capetian dynasty, in a world where daughters were taught from infancy that their bodies were pawns for alliances. She grew up listening to the echoes of her mother's weeping at night, the muffled screams of servants punished for imagined slights, and the careful, slippery words of courtiers who knew how to offer loyalty without ever meaning it. By the time Marguerite was 12, she could read a man's intentions in the way he set his cup down or glanced at his knife. Her marriage to Duke Raymond de Foix had been arranged before she had begun to bleed. The Duke, nearly twice her age, ruled lands on the fault line between the King of France's domain and the feudal chaos of Aquitaine, a borderland of constant raids, shifting allegiances, and quiet, enduring hatreds. At their wedding, Marguerite's veil was embroidered with roses, but the petals were stiff with gold thread, each needle prick a reminder of how beauty could be fashioned into a prison. Experts believe that Duke Raymond mistook Marguerite's silence for meekness. He prized her pale hands, the way she stood so still while he ranted about his enemies. But inside her, the bruises of girlhood were ripening into resolve. Every slap he delivered, every cold night she spent in a locked bedchamber, shaped a quiet determination to never again be someone else's property. In the third year of their marriage, the Duke began a campaign to seize a neighboring barony whose child lord had died of fever. It was then that Marguerite first crossed paths with Cardinal Bertrand d'Albret, a man as soft-spoken as he was relentless. The cardinal's red robes carried the scent of incense and old parchment, but his eyes missed nothing. He offered Marguerite comfort in words and counsel that hinted at a different future, a promise of support, if she could prove herself capable of acting beyond the boundaries expected of a dutiful wife. Archaeological findings from the ruins of Foix suggest that Marguerite spent weeks moving between the castle's upper chambers and the crypt beneath the chapel, meeting secretly with the cardinal's envoys. There, by candlelight, she weighed the price of her liberation. She remembered every time the Duke had dragged her into the hall by her hair, every humiliation she had endured before the eyes of his men. She thought of the girl she had once been, and the queen she might become. By late autumn of 1318, rumors were thick as fog across the valleys. Bands of mercenaries loyal to the cardinal began to appear near Foix, disguised as pilgrims. The Duke, drunk on his own triumphs, never noticed how many of his own knights quietly shifted their allegiance. Marguerite began to take her meals alone, citing a delicate constitution. In truth, she was waiting for word that all was ready. Historians describe a storm the night the plan was set in motion. thunder rolling across the hills, lightning revealing the twisted shapes of bare trees like the fingers of the dead reaching for the living. As Duke Raymond lay in a stupor from too much wine, Marguerite descended to the kitchens. There, a butcher's apprentice prepared the tools she had ordered. Knives sharp enough to slip between ribs, bowls ready to catch the blood. That night would mark the end of Marguerite's girlhood, and the birth of something the chronicles could not decide whether to call monstrous or magnificent. When the body was found, there was no official investigation, no outraged public mourning, no procession through the town square. Duke Raymond de Foix was declared dead of an unexpected illness, the result of excessive drink and an aging heart. Few questioned the cause. Those who did remembered quickly what happened to people who asked too many questions. In truth, the Duke had died before midnight, alone in his bed, but for the servant who smothered him with a pillow soaked in mare's milk and poppy. There was no struggle. The poppy had done its work. His eyes remained half open, cloudy and wet. His final breath was shallow, leaving a stain of wine and bile on the linen below his jaw. Marguerite was not present. She had already left the castle hours before the killing. According to records recovered from ecclesiastical archives, she rode through the night toward the estate of her second cousin, the Count of Armagnac, whose lands bordered the southern edge of the duchy. There, she claimed sanctuary, not as a fugitive, but as a grieving widow, invoking the rights of noble blood and the authority of her husband's former alliances. The next morning, news of the Duke's death reached the court. The priests were called to perform last rites, but by the time they arrived, the body had already been moved. Wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar, it was laid inside a cedar coffin and sealed with wax. No one, not even the Duke's own brother, was permitted to view the corpse. The explanation was decay, but the truth, according to one monastery record, was far more disturbing. The heart had been removed. A single phrase, scribbled in Latin in the margins of a prayer book from Saint Michel, offers a chilling account. Por ipsius ad convivium portatum est. His heart was brought to the feast. This is where the story slips from mere assassination into something far more symbolic and far more horrifying. Marguerite returned to Foix 2 weeks later, dressed in deepest mourning, her face pale beneath a widow's veil. She walked barefoot into the chapel, and there, in front of the high altar, she announced her betrothal to another man, the young Lord Amaury de Castelnau, a cousin of the cardinal, a soldier barely 25. It would be a marriage not of passion, but of consolidation. Through this union, Marguerite would keep control of the duchy. Through her, the Church and Cardinal d'Albret would hold the southern marches of France. But it was the wedding feast, held days later, that would enter legend. A banquet was arranged in the great hall of the chateau, now stripped of all signs of the old Duke. His banners were taken down, his coat of arms repainted. The musicians were paid in silver and silence. The guests arrived in carriages bearing the insignias of half the realm's feuding families, not because they loved Marguerite, but because they feared her. There are 3 surviving accounts of that night, all written in different tongues, all contradicting each other in the details: the number of courses served, the color of the bride's gown, the exact hour the torches began to die. But all agree on one detail. The main course, served to the bride and groom alone, was presented on a golden dish, steaming and spiced with rose water and cinnamon. And beneath the crust of sugared almonds and dried dates, hidden in the rich marrow of veal and wine sauce, was a man's heart, roasted, stuffed with sage and pine nuts, cut from the chest of the man Marguerite had married at 13, and now consumed before the eyes of the kingdom. Historians still debate whether Marguerite herself ordered the dish, or if it was prepared at the cardinal's suggestion, an act of psychological domination dressed as ritual. What is known is that she ate it, slowly, without blinking. And when the groom hesitated, she fed him with her own hand. To the guests, it was presented as a symbolic dish, a rite of union, flesh made one. But the whispers afterward grew darker with each retelling. Some claimed the Duke's bones were later crushed and buried in the chapel's foundations. Others insisted his soul still haunted the castle, his heart having never reached consecrated ground. In truth, the act was neither madness nor mere cruelty. It was a message, a declaration of sovereignty, a warning to any who might attempt to claim what Marguerite now held. She was no longer someone's wife. She was the Duchess in her own right, and her rule had begun with the taste of blood on her lips. From that night onward, the air in Foix grew thick with both dread and admiration. Those who once thought of Marguerite as a pawn now found themselves bowing before a woman who had proven herself more ruthless than any knight. Chroniclers of the period describe the weeks that followed as strangely silent. The castle's halls echoed with the cautious steps of servants who dared not whisper the name of the dead duke. The new lord, Amaury, sat at Marguerite's side in every council meeting, his youthful face pale, his eyes darting to her whenever disputes grew heated, as if seeking permission to speak. For a brief moment, the duchy was stable. Marguerite's alliances, cemented in terror and spectacle, forced rival barons to swear fealty. The borderlands quieted, raiders withdrew, and letters of congratulation arrived from both Avignon and Paris. Cardinal d'Albret's influence expanded like ink on wet parchment. He moved his people into key positions: abbots, stewards, commanders of hilltop garrisons. By winter's first snow, Marguerite's reign appeared unassailable. But peace built on fear is brittle. In the spring of 1320, a dispute over tithes erupted between Marguerite's tax collectors and the Abbey of Saint-Benoît. When the abbot refused to pay the new rates, Marguerite ordered his arrest. He was dragged from his cloister at dawn, his white habit torn and soiled in the mud of the courtyard. According to a scribe's later account, she stood at her window, expressionless, watching him forced onto a horse and taken to the castle. For days, rumors spread like wildfire. The abbot's fate became a question asked in every tavern and market. Some said Marguerite planned to hang him as a traitor. Others claimed she meant to flay him alive. Yet, when the abbey's brothers finally gathered the courage to approach the castle gates, they found the abbot released and returned, weakened but alive. His silence in the following weeks was absolute. He paid the demanded sum, and the abbey's bells rang in Marguerite's honor on her next name day. This episode marked a turn in how Marguerite was perceived. She was no longer just the woman who had devoured her husband's heart. She was the sovereign who could break a holy man's will without shedding a drop of blood. Chroniclers note that her eyes, once bright with youthful fire, now held a coldness like steel left too long in snow. Even Amaury, the new duke in name, began to withdraw into long hunts and visits to distant estates, leaving Marguerite to govern alone. It was in this atmosphere of tense quiet that Marguerite's first real challenge emerged, from within her own household. Old knights loyal to the House of Foix, men who had served the dead duke since his father's time, began to plot. In hushed gatherings in the stables and woods, they spoke of restoring the rightful order, of placing a male relative of Raymond on the ducal seat. Some even dreamed of marrying Marguerite to a cousin of the English king, forging an alliance that could break the cardinal's hold. One figure loomed largest among the conspirators, Sir Anselm de Montclar, a knight who had once been Raymond's hunting companion. He was no fool, but a man hardened by decades of border wars, who believed Marguerite's rule and the cardinal's shadow were affronts to the honor of every knight in the duchy. According to letters later intercepted by Marguerite's spies, Ansel described her as a she-wolf in a queen's cloak, and vowed to cut the heart from her chest as she once did to her husband. These words would become his doom, for Marguerite's informants brought every scrap of treason to her feet, feeding her fury with ink and parchment. In the summer of 1320, the conspirators gathered in the ruins of an old Roman watchtower near the eastern forests. The moon that night was thin and sickly, barely lighting the broken arches where they swore oaths of rebellion. They thought themselves unseen, but Marguerite's agents moved among them like ghosts, memorizing every word. When the conspirators returned to Foix, expecting to slip quietly back into the rhythm of court life, they found the gates barred. Torches burned at every tower, archers lined the walls, and in the courtyard, dressed not in black, but in a robe of deep crimson, stood Marguerite. She waited as the men were dragged before her. No word was spoken as she studied their faces, one by one, like a sculptor assessing flawed marble. In the silence of the courtyard, the only sounds were the restless stamping of horses and the crackle of pitch torches. The conspirators, 7 men in all, knelt on the flagstones, their hands bound behind their backs with cords that bit into their flesh. Night air carried the scent of moss and blood, mingling with Marguerite's perfume, a heavy, heady mixture of rose and clove that seemed almost sacramental in the darkness. According to a surviving confession recorded by Marguerite's own scribe, it was Sir Ansel who broke first. When her gaze fell on him, he looked up, his face pale and eyes wild, and began to babble denials. But Marguerite raised one hand, and his words caught in his throat like a fishhook. She stepped closer until their breath mingled in the chill air. Witnesses later recalled that she spoke softly enough that only Ansel heard her words, yet they struck him like hammer blows. He slumped, as if the marrow had drained from his bones, and began to weep. His tears stained the hem of her crimson robe. One by one, she questioned the men, but not with threats or shouts. She asked about their families, their estates, the promises they made to the dead duke. She forced them to confront the hollowness of their loyalty. And when they faltered, when their eyes dropped to the stones, she passed judgment. Some historians argue that Marguerite's power lay not in brute force, but in her mastery of fear, how she turned silence into a blade sharper than any sword. By dawn, the conspirators had been stripped of titles and lands. 3 were executed at the castle's northern wall, their bodies left hanging until the noon sun. The others were sent, shackled and bruised, to distant monasteries, where they would spend the rest of their lives praying for absolution they would never receive. But it was what Marguerite did with Sir Ansel that would enter the chronicles of every neighboring realm. Rather than kill him, she had him imprisoned in a small tower overlooking the river Ariège. There he was kept in a single windowless room, fed only bread and water, visited each morning by a silent monk who lit candles and read from a book of penitential psalms. Each evening, the candles were extinguished, plunging the night back into darkness. Days turned to weeks. The sounds of life outside, market bells, horse hooves, children's laughter, drifted up to him like echoes from another world. Records indicate he survived nearly 6 months in this state. By the time death finally came, he was said to have lost the power of speech, his hair grown long and matted, his eyes pale as milk. His body was buried without ceremony in unconsecrated ground, beneath a cairn of river stones. For Marguerite, this victory was a cold comfort. She had secured her rule by proving to every noble, priest, and merchant that she could not be challenged without paying a price measured in blood or sanity. Yet each triumph isolated her further. Amaury withdrew more deeply into his hunting lodges, avoiding the castle for weeks at a time. Even the cardinal, whose letters to Marguerite had once been filled with florid praise, grew curt and distant, as if the queen he helped create had become a creature beyond his control. Motifs of roses began to appear everywhere in Foix, embroidered into tapestries, carved into stone doorways, painted in miniature on official documents. Yet behind their delicate beauty, people recognized a deeper message. Roses masked thorns, and those thorns could draw blood at the slightest misstep. As the year waned and the nights lengthened, Marguerite walked the halls of her chateau alone, her footsteps echoing across the cold tiles. Servants learned to vanish from her path. At feasts, courtiers grew careful not to raise their voices, lest they awaken her displeasure. Even the castle dogs, once free to roam and bark, learned to cower when they caught her scent. Historians believe that Marguerite was not merely feared, but also revered, in the same way one might revere a storm or a plague, as something both magnificent and terrible, beyond human reckoning. Chroniclers wrote of a duchess who carried herself like a force of nature, eyes glittering with the memory of a night when she fed on a man's heart and found it tasted sweeter than any honeyed wine. The winter of 1320 arrived with unrelenting storms. Snow piled high against the castle walls, sealing Marguerite and her household in a world of silence, broken only by the crack of ice in the river and the howl of wind through arrow slits. Fires burned day and night in the hearths, yet the cold seeped into every stone, a reminder that even within her fortress, Marguerite was not immune to nature's indifference. This season of isolation brought both a hardening of her authority and the first signs of the cracks that would threaten her reign. Amaury, sullen and increasingly fearful of his wife, sent emissaries to his family lands in Castelnau, hinting he might soon leave Foix for good. His absence would leave Marguerite without the appearance of a consort, a dangerous vulnerability in a society that demanded a man's shadow behind every woman's power. Marguerite, aware of these rumors, acted with swift precision. Letters were dispatched under her seal, offering lavish gifts and new privileges to the lords of Castelnau in exchange for Amaury's continued presence. Yet she knew bribery alone would not suffice. One frigid morning, as snow fell like a shroud across the courtyards, she entered Amaury's chambers unannounced. According to an account by a servant hiding behind a tapestry, she spoke in a voice calm as the grave, promising him a life of unimagined comfort, or a death so quiet the world would forget he ever existed. By evening, Amaury had accepted his place at her side once more. But Marguerite's challenges did not end within her walls. Beyond the frozen forests, rival claimants to Foix's lands began to stir. The Vicomte de Béarn, a distant cousin of the dead Duke, forged alliances with disaffected knights and merchants whose fortunes had suffered under Marguerite's iron-fisted rule. They spread rumors that her power was unnatural, whispering that a woman who ate her husband's heart had consorted with demons to gain dominion over men. Superstition found eager ears in a time when plague and famine stalked the land, and fear could tip the balance of power more surely than any sword. Cardinal d'Albret, once the architect of Marguerite's ascent, began to doubt his creation. In letters preserved in the Vatican's archives, he fretted over her growing independence, warning that she had become a blade he could no longer wield. He advised her to marry again, this time to a noble favored by the French crown. But Marguerite refused. She would not surrender her autonomy to a man who might undo all she had built with blood and terror. Yet in rejecting the cardinal's counsel, Marguerite gained a new enemy. Bertrand d'Albret, who had once whispered of her greatness, now plotted her fall. He worked quietly, his agents spreading word to the Pope and the King of France that Marguerite's reign endangered the peace of the realm, that her rule incited rebellion and threatened the Church's authority. His letters painted her not as a rightful duchess, but as a usurper who sowed chaos. Meanwhile, inside the castle, the air grew tenser with each passing week. Marguerite's nights were haunted by dreams in which the dead Duke appeared at the foot of her bed. His chest, a hollow cavity, his mouth opening and closing without sound. She woke bathed in cold sweat, the scent of rose and rot lingering in her nostrils. The same dream came night after night, until she began to dread sleep more than the waking hours spent warding off conspiracies. According to a monk's diary, later smuggled to a neighboring abbey, Marguerite began spending long hours in the castle crypt, seated among the tombs of her husband's ancestors. There, with only the flickering light of tallow candles, she contemplated the thin line between the living and the dead. Some nights, servants heard her voice drifting up through the stone floors, chanting prayers not found in any holy book. Through it all, Marguerite's power seemed unassailable on the surface, but beneath the calm, cracks spidered outward from the night she consumed her husband's heart. Each rumor, each betrayal, each sleepless night widened the fissures. And beyond her gates, a coalition of old enemies and new opportunists gathered, preparing to challenge the Duchess, who had turned grief into a throne. By the thaw of early spring, 1321, the world beyond Marguerite's high stone walls had begun to move against her with the subtle inevitability of shifting tides. Snowmelt flooded the riverbanks, washing away old tracks and revealing new ones. Messengers on fast horses, bearing letters between Marguerite's enemies, traders passing whispered news along the market roads, strangers lingering too long outside the castle's outer gate. Each sign carried the promise of approaching conflict. Inside the chateau, the atmosphere thickened with a tension as bitter as the last winter winds. Marguerite's household lived as though each day might be the one when the drawbridge would never rise again. Servants moved quietly, guards changed shifts with nervous glances, and in the great hall, Marguerite herself presided over councils where every voice spoke carefully, eyes flicking to her face for signs of her shifting moods. The Vicomte de Béarn, emboldened by Cardinal d'Albret's secret encouragement, amassed an army from among dispossessed knights and restless young men hungry for plunder. His letters to other lords framed his cause as righteous, a crusade to rescue Foix from the unnatural reign of a woman who had overstepped the boundaries God had set for her sex. According to chroniclers sympathetic to the Vicomte, he claimed Marguerite's deeds had cursed the land. Crops failed, wolves prowled closer to villages, and stillbirths rose in number. Whether coincidence or invention, the stories spread like fire in dry grass. Marguerite, for her part, did not cower. She called for loyal knights from every corner of her lands, rewarding them with lands confiscated from those who had plotted against her. In letters preserved in regional archives, she reminded each vassal of the peace she had enforced and the prosperity that had briefly followed her consolidation of power. She ordered the forging of new weapons, the repairing of crumbling watchtowers, and the gathering of grain in secret granaries to withstand a siege. Foix became a fortress not just of stone, but of fearsome resolve. Experts who have studied her rule argue that Marguerite's genius lay in her understanding of spectacle as a tool of governance. She held public audiences wearing the same crimson robes she had donned to judge the conspirators the year before, the color now synonymous with her authority. She sent riders to every village proclaiming that anyone who took up arms against her would see their family lands burned, their kin enslaved. But she also promised that those who remained loyal would share in the spoils of her victory. Her threats were edged with hope, and her promises darkened by menace. The first direct blow came in late March. A band of mercenaries loyal to the Vicomte slipped through a mountain pass and raided one of Marguerite's supply convoys. The soldiers slaughtered the guards and scattered the wagons, leaving the roads littered with torn banners and broken wheels. When word of the attack reached the castle, Marguerite was said to have stood so still that her ladies thought her struck dumb. Then she laughed, not a sound of mirth, but a dry, cutting rasp that left everyone in the room cold. That same night, she ordered reprisals. Small bands of riders loyal to her swept across the countryside, torching hamlets known to shelter the Vicomte's supporters, hanging village leaders from oak trees as warnings. In each ruined square, They left messages pinned with daggers. Thus, the Queen of Foix rewards treachery. The violence sparked a cycle of bloodshed that quickly spun beyond anyone's control. As the month drew on, reports of burned farms and massacred travelers arrived daily. Both sides claimed victory after each skirmish, but in truth, neither could fully secure the roads or rivers. Trade slowed to a trickle. Hunger gnawed at the peasants, who cursed both Marguerite and the Viscount in equal measure as they watched their homes turned to ash. It was during these weeks that Marguerite's dreams of the hollow-chested Duke grew more vivid. Chroniclers recount how she awoke screaming some nights, convinced the castle itself was sinking into the earth, walls closing around her like a tomb. In her more lucid moments, she pressed Amaury for his loyalty, though by then he had grown as brittle as old wood, his soul worn thin by the knowledge that his wife was both shield and executioner. Through the chaos, Marguerite's eyes remained clear. She began to understand that there could be no peace, no truce, only an end bought by the final defeat of her enemies or by her own fall. In the heat of midsummer, 1321, the final days of Marguerite's reign unfurled with a grim inevitability. The valley below Foix lay parched and cracked under a sun that showed no mercy. The river dwindled to a thin, sour thread, its stagnant pools reflecting a sky bleached of all softness. The people whispered that the land itself had turned against the queen, who once commanded storms of blood, and in every gust of hot wind, they heard the hiss of God's displeasure. Beyond the castle walls, the Vicomte de Béarn's forces gathered like carrion birds. They did not rush the fortress, but circled it, cutting off every road, poisoning every well, waiting for the weight of hunger and fear to do what steel could not. The siege was quiet, methodical, a slow strangulation designed to rot Foix from within. Inside, the air grew thick with the sweet, sick stench of disease. It spread first among servants who slept in the lowest chambers, then to guards who drank from the fouled cisterns. Marguerite ordered the sick locked in the old granary, their cries muffled behind doors barred with iron. Each dawn brought new bodies dragged to the chapel steps, shrouded in linen no prayer could redeem. Amaury, the silent consort, fell ill next. His fever dreams cracked what little resolve remained in him. He called out names from childhood, wept for lost friends, begged forgiveness from unseen judges. Marguerite watched over him with a gaze cold as polished steel, feeding him sips of water, measuring each breath. When he recovered, he was a hollow man, a shade flinching at her shadow. By the time the first leaves turned, Marguerite's world had shrunk to the fortress walls and the tightening circle of her enemies. At her last council, she stood beneath the stained glass window of St. Margaret and the Dragon, its fractured light painting her face in shards of crimson and gold. Those who loved her once now feared her. Those who feared her once now pitied her. When the castle gates finally opened, it was not to the roar of a victorious army, but to a silence broken only by crows. Chroniclers disagree on whether Marguerite surrendered or whether the gates were forced. Some write of her slipping into the chapel one final time, kneeling among the bones of her husband's ancestors, lips moving in a prayer no one heard. Others tell of her being led in chains through the courtyard, unbowed, eyes fierce to the last. But all agree on what followed. The duchy was carved up among her enemies. The cardinal's men returned to Avignon laden with plunder, and the people of Foix were left to bury the dead. Marguerite's name became a gust on every tongue, a symbol of a woman who seized power in a man's world and paid the price demanded by that world's unyielding laws. And yet, long after the last stone of her castle crumbled into ivy-choked ruin, mothers in the valleys told tales of the queen who ate her husband's heart to claim her own destiny. Some spoke her name with hatred, others with awe, but all remembered her, Marguerite, the blooded rose of Foix, a woman who dared to rule and endure.